Thank you very much. I'm, of course, very honored to be here on this important conference. And I will talk a bit about my arguments here. They will be that it's impossible to understand the development of the use of psychedelics in Norway from the 1960s, basically, with a long break, then a kind of revival over the past couple of decades, without going even further back to the 1920s, 1930s, and to try to sort of catch some of the intellectual developments within philosophy, psychology, and theology. So there we will find the kind of fertile ground, which was then picked up by the entrepreneurs in the 1960s. Then we got this kind of backlash in the late 1960s, fueled by the war on drugs, which probably most of you are well aware of. And then we got this revival a couple of decades ago, with an illegal subculture centering on the mystical, but also with much research in this area. Let us then jump back 100 years. There were mostly males in this area at the time. And we have three portraits here. The two first are the extremely gifted brothers, Schjelderup, Christian and Harald. And they were intellectuals exploring what we could call the sacred, the mystical, the holy, in numerous writings around the First World War. They were born in the late 1890s. The other guy here is Ola Raknes, philosopher, psychoanalyst, who perhaps was the most important among these figures. The idea here is that this was not very uncommon in Norway at the time. It's very different from what we see in philosophy and psychology today. But the idea is that there is much between earth and heaven, that we have to explore these experiences, kind of supernatural experiences. That was quite a common theme in even top-level intellectuals, as for instance Ola Raknes. His thesis was called Møte med det hellige, Encountering the Sacred, published in 1927. And he described these experiences that most of us could reach also without psychedelics, also actually without religious surroundings, as ecstatic and overwhelming forms of consciousness. You could experience unity with God or with inner depths of existence. If we go back to one of the key papers by Griffiths and co-workers at Johns Hopkins, 2008, we will see formulations that are quite similar to that. Most of you will probably know this paper, where psychedelics are supposed to give us experiences similar to spontaneously occurring mystical or religious experiences. So we have, all of you have perhaps this idea that there is this kind of a tradition, but I think it's very easy if you go into the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, to see that. And these two brothers, Christian Schjelderup, he became one of the most important bishops in the Norwegian Ordinary State Church later around the Second World War. And his brother, Harald Schjelderup, became first professor of philosophy, then professor of psychology, the first professor in Norway. And the house at Blindern campus is named after him, Harald Schjelderup's hus. So this is a very strong tradition, which it's easy to forget when we go into the 1960s. And my argument will be then that Gordon Johnson, who started it all in Norway, he was living in a kind of environment where he was obviously very much familiar with the writings of all these three figures. So he was a medical doctor, trained in psychiatry. He was brought up in the United States, but came from a Norwegian family, and came to Oslo and was asked to build up the new psychiatric ward at Lovisenberg in the mid-1950s. And then he became director at Modum Bad's sanatorium, which he was for almost 20 years. And his theoretical orientations was towards psychodynamic therapy, very familiar with Freud, but also LSD. And in total, they gave around 2,200 sessions at Modum, very many conducted by himself. He was a Christian, deeply devoted. He was a leader of Misjonssambandet, which is quite, people would say, quite an orthodox Christian organization, author of several books about how to live, cultural things, a very clear public intellectual. And that's interesting because this is very far from the hippie movement which he would encounter very few years later. And in his first writings, he describes LSD in the same manner as they do today, like giving a spiritual, cosmic dimension, very closely linked to his religious thinking as well. So it's very interesting that this was the guy who started it all in Norway. And it's very easy to see this tradition back to these founding fathers of the 1920s. So he treated very many persons, and several of them have written about this. But I think one of the most interesting, actually, is this guy. So this is the beautiful institution where they did psychotherapy and pastoral care. Sjelesorg was also what they were doing, giving at Modum, and they still do that. So one of these most, just to see this period of optimism in the first couple of 3, 4, 5 years of the 1960s. The background was, of course, that there was, obviously, people believed in the use of psychopharmacological drugs in the 1950s. Neuroleptics had come for treatment of psychosis. And still, I would say that Gordon Johnson was probably even more oriented towards Europe, particularly Germany, and was a key member of Europäischen Medizinischen Gesellschaft für psycholytische Therapie. Psycholytisch means something like mind-opening. And particularly Germany, he had very close allies, but also England, Netherlands, Switzerland, and of course even the United States, which in some manners were the biggest in this area. So they did psychodynamic therapy combined with LSD based on the rationale that this was much more effective. And in 62, 63, there were reports about promising results at Modum in the largest newspapers, VG, Aftenposten. But one of his most interesting patients was a very close friend of him, who he had met when he was a medical doctor at Lovisenberg, a Christian, Alfred Hauge, from the southwestern part of the country, which is sometimes called the Bible Belt. And they were very much bound together through the Christian faith. And he got several treatments in the early 60s at Modum. And he had typically written quite traditional novels where his faith was in center. But after these treatments with LSD by Gordon Johnson himself, he had this kind of mystery turns in his writings. So he became very much a much more experimental author. He established a new kind of meta-narrative fiction where there was a writer commenting on his own experiences. And the most famous books, which started a cyclus of 7 books, was Mysterium, 1967, or Mystery. So he's a very interesting character because he is very easy to put in this long tradition back to the Schjelderup brothers. There were other interesting authors who got LSD treatment. These were three of the most prominent authors in Norway at the time. Agnar Mykle, Aksel Jensen, and Jens Bjørneboe. But these were kind of, at least the two last here, were kind of more outsider left-wing guys. But they also became strong advocates for the use of LSD that could have beneficial treatments. All got treatments with LSD, and all were, I would say, people suffering from lots of problems. And also, I would say, the most central intellectual in Norway, Arne Næss, professor of philosophy at the time. He had some recreational experiences with that. He was a very aristocratic guy, I remember him, mountain climber, interested in ecology, and he was also a kind of advocate. But I think these represent a kind of break where we started to see something new happening. And that was also linked to the increasing tension in the mid-1960s. From the States, it was clearly much more clear that you had to have good, rigorous research for the introduction of new psychoactive substances in treatment, and double-blind controlled trials had now become the gold standard. And that was, of course, as you all will understand, problematic with regard to LSD. Everybody knows that they have taken LSD based on the experiences. And the American Psychiatric Association became increasingly skeptical. And Karl Evang, who was the very powerful director of health, he served for 34 years, much more important than all of his political ministers. He changed gradually his position and said in 1965 that we have seen dramatic relapses here. So this was, of course, strengthened by the fact that we got the hippie movement. This is from the Royal Park, the Royal Palace Park outside the palace, and the house backstage there is Faculty of Law at the university. So this was one of the most prominent places in Norway, actually, where these guys started to hang out in the summer of 1967, which was called the Summer of Law, as you know, with completely new references, new ideas about politics, strong criticism towards the United States, Vietnam War, and stuff like that, and with the use of cannabis and LSD. So we can say that there is a very interesting break here in the mid-60s from Christian-influenced encounters with the sacred, where the state church and prominent bishops, key authors in that tradition, were advocates, to a youth drug problem. It all happened in a couple of years, actually. Then we get the real backlash, and that's in 1967 to 1972, I would say. So the main reasons were that there was a lack of solid scientific evidence here and this provocative subculture. And this last culture obviously resulted in the war on drugs starting out actually in the late 1960s. The penal code comes to include LSD as narcotic, and it became also much more increasing pressure towards Gordon Johnson himself, who was kind of the key figure still all through the period he served as director. And in 1966-69, Johnson himself, in a very big article in one of the key newspapers, warns against Timothy Leary, who at the time had become a very prominent intellectual figure in the United States, as probably most of you know. And he warned against him an increasing recreational use of LSD, which he stated could be, as opposed to what they were doing at Modum and the controlled conditions, could be like stabbing a knife in the brain. So in 1972, there was a final treatment at Modum. This picture is taken in 1982, I think, the year before he dies. It's the King Olav, our King Olav, the father of the present king, is at the center of the picture. This is taken from Modum. You see the houses at Modum at the right there. He had been awarded, Gudrun Johnsen had been awarded Royal Order of St. Olav, which is a very prominent order in Norway, and he's smiling, but at the time he suffered very much from being stigmatized, from being accused of horrible things actually, and I think behind this smile there is quite a deep feeling of kind of outside the position in the Norwegian society. He dies the year after. So then we get this revival, which is the reason why we are gathered here today. And I think this is, of course, related to increasing research interest. Many of you are doing research on this area. But there is also a much larger illegal psychedelic scene in Norway and in other countries. And we have done interviews with 50 users of psychedelics, which we have published in quite a few papers. Some of you have been very kind to give us your experiences, and some of you are here today. Thank you very much for that. And these, I've been doing research on use of different drugs for 3 or 4 decades almost. And these, the short form of what is the psychedelic user like is that he's not like an ordinary drug user. It doesn't remind me much of people doing cocaine or people doing amphetamines or heroin or very much alcohol and things like that. Even if some of them have experiences with that as well. The stories we have heard reflecting experiences of ego death, of the sacred and the mystical, it reminds me very much of what I read when I read the Schjelderup brothers and Raknes 100 years ago. So it's very interesting and very long line here that probably we will hear the kind of manifestations of later during this conference. Thank you very much.